Letter to the Editor, Miner's Journal, January 1st, 1863. This being the first day of the new year, I concluded to write a communication to the journal, and with it send a list of the loss of my regiment since its organization in Harrisburg, PA 1 year ago last August. The old year is numbered with the past. To us as a nation, it has been indeed an eventful one. Thousands of our brave sons and comrades in arms have yielded up their lives as willing sacrifices that the nation might be preserved. We enter today upon a new year in 1863. What shall be its history? May we hope ere its close to see peace restored to our now distracted country, peace founded in justice, righteousness, and universal liberty. May all the benign influences of a good government enfold our nationality, and all the horrors cease. J.K. Siegfried, Colonel, commanding 48th Pennsylvania Regiment. Winter camp near Falmouth, Virginia dragged on for the 48th. It was quiet and monotonous. If they weren't manning picket lines along the Rappahannock, they were trying to keep warm during the frequent snowstorms and frigid cold weather. Regimental drills were held every day, which at least gave them something to do. Under pressure from Washington, on January 26, General Burnside resigned from the command of the Army of the Potomac. General Joseph Hooker was appointed in his stead. On the 6th of February, the regiment was ordered to Aquia Creek Landing, where they would load transports and be shipped to Fortress Monroe. At Aquia Creek, they boarded the transport North America with the 6th New Hampshire and 2nd Maryland. They reached Fort Monroe that evening and spent the night on the ship. The next morning, they steamed to Newport News, disembarked and encamped. They remained here until the 25th of March. Their old buck and ball Enfields were replaced with brand new breech-loading Springfield rifles. At 1 o'clock on March 25th, the men boarded the John A. Warner. They were abuzz with rumor and speculation, not quite knowing where they were headed. The ship let loose from the wharf at 3 a.m., with the 6th New Hampshire and the 48th on board. By the time the sun rose, the men soon learned they were headed to Baltimore with orders for the division to transfer to Kentucky, to join the Department of Ohio under General Burnside. Thursday, March 26th at 9 p.m., they reached the wharves in Baltimore. In the early morning of the 27th, the men loaded on the train cars of North Central Railroad and set off. The train went through York, Mifflin, Altoona, and Pittsburgh, and the men were greeted and cheered at every station. When they reached Cincinnati, Ohio, the men were entertained with a wonderful feast at the market house. By March 31st, after a long trip, the train arrived in Lexington, Kentucky. The regiment was moved to the old fairgrounds about a mile from the business part of the city and encamped. The regiment was now detailed as the city provost guard, with Colonel J.K. Siegfried as commandant. On April 13th, the camp was changed to an abandoned hemp warehouse on the outside of the city, which gave the men some welcome cover and more comfortable living conditions. This period is what the men called their soft snap. Lexington was a beautiful city, and their stay was very pleasant. In fact, a good number of men found their love in Lexington and ended up getting married. Their duties consisted of furnishing guards for the railroad stations, ordnance depots, and jails, and patrolling the city day and night to preserve order. On the 9th of May, the 48th learned of the serious condition of General James Naugle's health from the story of the 48th. General James Naugle, who ever since its formation, now more than a year, has commanded the 1st Brigade and 2nd Division, 9th Army Corps, and has led it through all its battles, has resigned on the account of ill health. The general was beloved by all his command, possessed the confidence and esteem of his superior officers, and more than once received proof of his acknowledged ability from General Burnside himself. He was the embodiment of a true soldier, a strict disciplinarian. He was humane and kind as a father or dear friend, approachable at all times by even the lowest. He was brave, prudent, honest, and good, and his form, countenance, and bearing inspired the beholder with the belief that he was born to command. In the closing of his military career, our country loses one of their bravest and most honest, patriotic, and faithful officers. General Naugle left for home on the 22nd of May, and his men all saw him off the train station, hats in hand. Colonel Siegfried was now put in charge of the brigade. June, July, and August passed with relative ease, with very few exceptions. On June 27, 2 members of Company C were stabbed in a bar brawl downtown. One ended up dying. No arrests were made as the attackers were never ascertained. On August 1st, a man named Hart was hung for murdering his wife 2 years prior, and the crowd was restless. The 40th was assigned to keep order during the execution. The next day, a large consignment of 300 prisoners, mostly from Louisiana, were moved through Lexington to Louisville, and the 48th provided guard. August 3rd was Election Day, and the men were assigned as guards to the polling places. All the bars were closed. It was described as the quietest election in the history of Kentucky. Finally, on the 10th of September, the regiment was ordered to move out. Leaving its quarters, they marched down Limestone Street to Maine. The people of the city turned out in great droves to bid goodbye. After almost 6 months of living in Lexington, the men felt like they were leaving home all over again. On the 12th of September, they reached Camp Dick Robinson. Here the 9th Corps was reformed and consisted of the 48th Pennsylvania, 2nd Maryland, 6th New Hampshire, and 21st Massachusetts, with Colonel Siegfried commanding. And so began their long walk to Tennessee. They marched through Lancaster, Crab Orchard, to Mount Vernon. The men from Pennsylvania coal country were amused to see coal veins cropping out on the surface beside the road, with people helping themselves to it here and there, shoveling coal into small carts and wagons. Then onward through Loudon, and they climbed the Cumberland Gap through Wildcat Mountain, Kentucky. The men amused themselves by standing on the stone that marked the borders of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. By the 23rd of September, they made it to the partially destroyed town of Tazewell, Tennessee. From there, they marched to the Clinch River and waded across since the bridge was recently destroyed. They continued this hot, long walk until the 28th of September, when they finally halted about a mile from Knoxville. After 19 days and 200 miles of hard movement, the men were ready for a rest. For the following 8 days, the men rested and enjoyed what Knoxville had to offer. On October 4th, the brigade was roused and put on 3 long trains and headed toward Morristown. When they reached Morristown, the train halted and waited for orders. By 7 p.m., the train was moving again and stopped at Bull's Gap, where by 10 p.m., the men disembarked and bivouacked. At 8 a.m. on the 5th, the men were roused and marched 4 miles to Lick Creek. Here the men occupied a line of battle until the 10th of October. At 9 a.m. on the 10th, the 48th was ordered to move ahead. After about 7 miles, they were ordered to deploy as skirmishers on a high ridge. In front of them, the cavalry was already skirmishing with the enemy, while an artillery battery pounded away at the rebels. Along with the 21st Massachusetts, they charged a large patch of woods, killing and wounding a large number of rebels. As the afternoon darkness fell over the battlefield, the fighting ceased and the 48th took up picket positions. The next morning, when the pickets moved forward, it was found that the enemy had left during the night. A pursuit was ordered, and at once they followed them for 20 miles to Reetown. It was concluded they couldn't catch the retreating rebels, so they were ordered back to Morristown, and from there took the train back to Knoxville. In 11 days, they had marched 72 miles. October 21st, the 48th was ordered on trains which took them to Loudon. The men learned that Longstreet had been sent with 28,000 men from Chattanooga north to try to capture Burnside and his entire army. Burnside and the rest of the much decimated 9th Army Corps numbered around 8,000 men. The men occupied the north side of the river and set up defenses awaiting the inevitable attack by Longstreet's men. Pontoon bridges were set up to allow the men back and forth because the existing railroad bridge was destroyed. On the 27th, feeling pressure from Longstreet's oncoming forces, the men were ordered back across the bridges to the north side of the river. When most of them were across, the task of pulling up the pontoon bridges began. During this time, a squad of rebel cavalry appeared on the south side of the river, displaying a flag of truce. These cavalry from the 1st Georgia Regiment demanded the immediate surrender of Loudon, or its evacuation within 2 hours. Little did they know that this was already in the process. The men finished pulling up the bridges, cutting off access for the rebels to their side of the river. The excitement of the day happened when a federal train and freight cars was started up on the south side of the river from the 48th in the war. An incident of the day was the destruction of an engine and 4 freight cars remaining on the south side, the former being fired up and then started at full speed towards the river. It was a thrilling sight as it swept along to where the bridge had been, and then, amidst the shouts of soldiers, it shot out into space, plunged into the river, and sank out of sight. The following day, knowing they were outnumbered, the men moved 6 miles northeast of Loudon to Lenore's Mill. On the 11th of November, the men moved back up to the river to protect men laying a new 640-foot pontoon bridge. 21st Massachusetts took small boats across to the other side to protect it from enemy attacks. The bridge took 8 days to complete, but allowed the men a way to gather intel on the enemy on the opposite bank. They sent multiple expeditions across the bridge the next few days to gather intelligence and recapture supplies left abandoned when they pulled back from Loudon. On the morning of the 14th, the pontoon bridge was pulled back, being destroyed in 2 short hours. The brigade moved back towards Loudon. Its orders were to slow down Longstreet's advance towards Knoxville. The 23rd Army Corps began to skirmish with the rebels across the river, and soon the 1st Brigade, including the 48th, were ordered to relieve them. The orders were to hold back the enemy to give the wagon trains and artillery time to move back to Knoxville. The line was held until about 4 p.m., and then the men started pulling back. The men were actively skirmishing with the enemy as they fell back towards Lenoir. As they reached Lenoir after dark, rations were issued and the men kept moving, reaching Campbell's Station at dawn. Upon reaching Campbell Station on the morning of the 15th, 40th was immediately posted at Kingston Road to try to hold in check any enemy trying to flank their forces. As the 40th set up defenses, they were harassed by rebel skirmishes for most of the day of the 15th. At 8 a.m. on the 16th, rebels attacked en masse on both the main road and the flank where the 48th waited. Rebels pushed in on their defenses. Not wanting to make a full force engagement since Burnside knew he was vastly outnumbered, he ordered the men to move and counter-move to avoid head-on fights. This lasted until dark when the fighting ceased. Immediately, the regiment was rapidly marched to Knoxville, reaching it by daylight on the morning of the 17th. Most of the 17th was spent with pick and shovel, creating entrenchments that ran from the Houston River to the south side of town, then all around the other side of town and back to the river. Fort Sanders, a large earthwork, served as a linchpin to the entrenchments that encircled Knoxville. The 40th occupied defenses on a bluff along the East Tennessee-Virginia Railroad. 2 large culverts lay below them, allowing 2 small creeks to flow through. These were subsequently stopped up to create a floodplain, making the approach impossible without a boat. One evening, the men were pushed back to a second line. At daybreak the next morning, the 48th and the 21st Massachusetts formed a line in charge of their former defenses, pushing the enemy out and retaking their former lines. From the story of the 48th. During the Siege of Knoxville, the enemy frequently attempted to drive in our pickets who were posted on the outskirts on the plain or level portion where the houses, mostly of wood, had been burned to prevent Longstreet's men from gaining shelter. Should they advance near to our works situated on a low elevation within the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad. On one occasion, the night being dark and stormy, the pickets of the enemy advanced rapidly, and though our pickets, when hard-pressed, retreated from chimney to chimney of burned houses, tried hard to hold their ground, they were slowly forced back to the shelter of the main line, notwithstanding the heroic efforts of the gallant officer, Major Gilmore, to prevent it. Later in the night, he forced their line back some distance, but could not entirely recover his position. The following morning at daybreak, Colonel J.K. Siegfried of the 40th Pennsylvania temporarily commanded the brigade, led an attack upon the entire rebel picket line. 48th was part of the attacking column. One night, rebel pickets had pushed into town, occupying some of the houses. The Federals pushed in, moving house to house, and with hard-fought hand-to-hand combat attempted to dislodge them from these homes. The entire line was recaptured, however. During this, Captain Hoskins and Company F, not hearing the command to halt, kept moving forward until they found themselves well beyond town in a cemetery and surrounded. Captain Hoskins, realizing the mistake, also realized that retreating back to the lines would put them in full face of fire and probably decimate his company. So he made a plan. One man at a time would leave cover and retreat back to their lines, Captain Hoskins being last. He ordered them to walk, saying, "Brave men must respect brave men, and if they walked out showing no fear, they should be unmolested." Amazingly, this plan worked. One at a time, the men would get up and slowly walk back up the incline towards the center of town. For the most part, they weren't shot at. Eventually, the rebels found this a fun game and started shooting near them, yelling, "Run, Yank, run!" The men gladly capitulated and ran. The rumor was that Grant was sending reinforcements to help out the besieged Knoxville. Hearing this, General Longstreets decided to attack in full force on November 29th. Just before daybreak, the Confederates charged Fort Sanders. Stakes were set all around the fort and telegraph wires were ran between them to create obstructions. This worked, and when the rebels reached them, they found themselves tripping over them and being trampled. The ones that actually reached the ramparts of Fort Sanders met with fierce hand-to-hand combat and were bayoneted. After a few feeble charges, the rebels pulled back. Finding he couldn't starve out the enemy easily or attack the entrenched city, Longstreet pulled up stakes and headed back to Virginia. On Monday, December 7th, the brigade left Knoxville via the Morristown Road, following the rebels towards Virginia. They turned off into Rutledge Road and after 12 miles encamped for the night. On the 8th, they resumed their march to Blaine's Crossroads. The rumor was that the rebels were sending another force against Knoxville, so the regiment set up defenses. The men were ragged and worn. The siege of Knoxville was hard on the men, and their condition was deplorable. The countryside was already stripped by the moving Virginia army, so foraging for supplies was few and far between. 2 ears of corn and 8 ounces of flour constituted a day's rations. Most of the men were tentless, blanketless, without overcoats or a change of clothing. Most men were now footsore, shoes being a commodity, and a good portion of the men only wore rags on their feet to try to protect them. Their shelters were holes in the ground, They were covered with 2 logs and pine boughs underneath for bedding. As they settled in, they started building shelters for winter cabins. Some of the men likened their situation to Valley Forge. As Christmas came, the shoddy, tired, and worn-out men wondered what 1864 would bring.